Hi there, Jon Pahl here for our Paulian provocation on the Church of the East, that is the non Chalcedonian Christians, and then the rise of Islam as well. And the key question that we'll be asking is what if? What if Christians had cooperated rather than competed and, in many cases, killed each other? And what if Christians had also worked with Muslims rather than seeing them immediately as heretics? So that's the big question of what if, the possibility of ecumenical cooperation, and then interreligious cooperation. We'll see how was potential that was lost in so many ways in these centuries. So, Chapter 7, Defying Chalcedon, Asia and Africa, um, compresses a lot here, documenting first Miaphysite Christianity and its missions. Coming out of Alexandria, the center of the Miaphysites, who opposed Chalcedonians as Melkites, that is, as the emperor's people. Key center for Miaphysite Christianity among the Copts, that is in Egypt, and then also in Western Syria and in Asia Minor in Turkey. Key event during this time period, of course, is the fall of Rome in 410, after which the Roman Empire disintegrates in many ways, and you had the Pope and Constantinople in formal schism between 482 and 519, the first of many schisms between the Church in the Byzantine Empire and the Church of Rome. Theodora, the Empress Theodora, appears again here. She's a sympathizer with the Miaphysites, and she helps spread it throughout parts of the Byzantine Empire, and especially to the south, to Nubia, Sudan. A key figure here is St. George. We'll see him again. He's a militant Christian, and that is part of the legacy of this era is this increasing militarization of Christianity. While Theodora lives, she manages to keep the peace, and fascinating character, would be a great final project biography. But there are splits, the Syrian Orthodox Church splits, and there is a rise of Miaphysite monasteries as well during this particular time period. A little aside or tangent, the characters of Sergius, the patron saint of Arabs, a soldier martyr, and Bacchus, another soldier martyr. These two were lovers. That's not my word for it. That's the description in the historical record. And so you have here an example of same-sex love in early Eastern Christianity. Georgia and Armenia are two key ways Miaphysitism spreads. In Georgia, they eventually agreed with Chalcedon, but in Armenia, never. Both started in opposition to the Chalcedonian formula. And the Armenians are particularly known down to today for the Trisagion, holy God, the formula, holy God, holy and strong, crucified for us, holy and immortal. This very distinctive formulation of the Trinity as opposed to, and Christology as opposed to Chalcedon. The second section of this chapter is on Ethiopia, the Christianity of union. The great city of Axum, the kingdom of Axum, and King Ezana are known as Christians in Ethiopia from the 4th century on. We don't have much by the way of records from earlier, but of course there is the story of the conversion of the Ethiopian eunuch in Acts, which we have no reason to believe is not historical. The Ethiopian eunuch in the court of the Queen of Sheba. Ethiopian Christianity down to today is known for its monasticism and for its strong relationship to Alexandria and the church there. Distinctly African in character, MacCulloch notes, focusing on the use of drums and other percussion in liturgy, and then an emphasis especially on tawahido, unity. There's the same word in Arabic, tawhid, that becomes one of the key teachings within Islam, and one of the key ways that Islam then contrasts with the schisms and wars between Christians. Ethiopian Christianity down to today is marked by a fascination with Judaism, celebration of the Jewish Sabbath or Shabbat on Saturday, along with the Christian Sunday celebrations, and there is an emphasis on keeping kosher, following Jewish dietary laws, and then also the story of the Ark of the Covenant making its way to Ethiopia. MacCulloch notes somewhat snarkily that the Ark had crosses on it, which of course would not have been a Jewish symbol. But anyway, it's an important story signifying the persistence and presence of Judaism both in Alexandria and then also in Ethiopia. King Caleb is a key character here. In 520, he defeats the Yemeni and establishes Christianity there too. So you have Christianity on the Arabian Peninsula. MacCulloch here points to a geological phenomenon, a tragedy that occurs, the failure of the Manib Dam, which is actually mentioned in the Quran and obliterates the Christian community on the Arabian Peninsula. Of course, once Islam came, that proceeded even more rapidly. The Church of the East, then, in Iran, Christians strongly present in Iran, despite Zoroastrian attempts to slaughter up to 150,000 Christians in what is now Kirkuk, which is part of the Persian Empire, the Iranian Empire at the time. In Syria, again, you have a booming church, what is now Iraq, Iran, and Eastern Turkey. They're Diophysites as opposed to Miaphysites. Big school, Christian school in Gandhashapur, which is now in Iran, teaches physicians who then serve the Shah as well. Eventually, Baghdad eclipses this school. Baghdad becomes the primary school, university, seminary, kind of all wrapped up together. And there are unfortunately just scant ruins left of this amazing Syrian Christian school in Gandhashapur. Christians are split between Diophysite and Miaphysite, but still don't identify any of them with the Imperial Church of Chalcedon, either in its Byzantine manifestation or with the Church of Rome. So the Church of the East sets up its own hierarchy, its own Catholicos. He was called the Universal Bishop by the 500s. So again, you see this growth of Miaphysite Christianity in these regions where we don't normally associate Christian presence. And this is the story of, sort of vanishing futures, these lost heritages, and they often don't appear in historical records either, which is a credit to MacCulloch for having emphasized this. What if Christians had cooperated rather than killed each other? The story of Christianity in India is fascinating, and there are others on our faculty who could tell it better than I, but the Mar Thoma Church is in Kerala by the 4th century. But of course, the heritage is Thomas the Apostle made a missionary trip to India. His tomb is there. Who knows? There were certainly trade routes from the Roman Empire and Palestine to India, so it's a possibility at least. And that is definitely the lineage or heritage that Indian Christians carry down to today, including especially still in Kerala. Sri Lanka, Christians find a niche there within the indigenous cultures, and the same is true in India. Hinduism, by this point, has been around for thousands of years. But Hinduism was at that time quite tolerant of diverse faiths, and so Christianity flourished there. And unfortunately, by the 16th century, when Protestant missionaries made their way there, and Roman Catholic missionaries as well, they considered these Mar Thoma Christians heretics and destroyed much of their history in a truly unfortunate development. Lutheran missionaries slightly different story and a better story in that regard as well, but that's one we can tell next semester. The Syrian roots of Christianity emphasize especially the story of Jonah, set in what was at the time Syria and Nineveh in particular. And there's a big Christian presence in Nineveh. The Bishop of Nineveh, in fact, develops there what MacCulloch calls an optimistic theology. That is, human nature. Because Jesus was fully human, that must mean human nature itself is good. And MacCulloch contrasts this, I think, deftly with the savage pessimism, as he puts it, of Western Christianity, following especially from St. Augustine and the development of the notion of original sin. That's not to say that there wasn't an emphasis on sin within Syrian Christianity too. But it definitely was a more optimistic, positive-looking form of Christianity, going back, MacCulloch notes, to the Alexandrians again, and to Origen, including the notion of universal salvation. Quote on page 250. This particular thinker, Evagrius of Pontus, through Isaac, a 7th century monk from Qatar, who was briefly the bishop of Nineveh, said he saw divine love even in the fire of hell, which prepared humanity for a future ecstasy. So, precursor of what became the notion of purgatory. Hell was purgatorial, that is a way to purge sin. And so, out of it, and this is a quote, the wealth of God's love and power and wisdom will become known all the more, and so will the insistent might of the waves of God's goodness. It is not the way of the compassionate Maker to create rational beings in order to deliver them over mercilessly to unending affliction for things of which God knew even before they were fashioned. End quote. So this emphasis on universal salvation within Christianity, again, back to the Alexandrian theologians, through Syria, and then, in many places throughout the Church of the East, not so much in the Church of the West until well into the 16th century. So you have Miaphysite strongholds in Armenia, Georgia, Egypt, Nubia, Sudan, Ethiopia, and in China. There's, Christian missionary presence there too, very early. Monasteries that continue to exist, the library pagoda, and one of the sites there still stands in China, going back to the 5th, 6th century. One of the key elements, and Japan and Mongolia too, we'll talk about those more. One of the key elements about the Church of the East is, though, that it was never allied with a royal family, which is both a strength and a challenge or a problem. So the Byzantines and the Church of the East battle against each other, which winds up weakening both. And again, this story, what if there was not this rift over the doctrine of the Trinity and Christology, but Christians had, and of course there were other power issues underneath those theological debates, but what if the church had continued to be a strong presence in these regions? Because once Islam came, dating back to roughly 622, Islam spread rapidly through these regions. Through military might, yes, but also through other means that contrasted quite clearly with Christian controversy and conflict. Muhammad, MacCulloch rightly calls a poetic genius. Little question about that. It's hard to catch this in the English translations of the Quran, but if you are ever able to attend Muslim prayer, the chanting of the Quran is really gorgeous, and many musicologists see the sort of melismatic chanting of the Quran in both the call to prayer and in the service itself. The Quran is intended to be sung. see that kind of melismatic chanting as the origins of the blues and jazz, something, of course, near and dear to my heart. Muhammad, though, fascinating figure, and one of those pivotal moments in history. He is from Mecca, but as he develops his visions and is taught to recite what became the Quran, he must withdraw from Mecca to Medina in 622, and it's that withdrawal that is taken as the date of the beginning of Islam. And this withdrawal, the word hijrah, is the same word as root in Arabic as Hajj. So this notion of pilgrimage, which became, of course, so central to Islam. But by 632, within 10 years, Muhammad is set in Mecca by the time of his death. So very rapidly converted the various tribes on the Arabian Peninsula and brought them into unity, this notion of Tawheed. MacCulloch says nicely, there were not forced conversions in early Islam, which is very notable. Not the case with Christians, as we'll see when we talk more about Russia. And MacCulloch points out that to understand the power of the Quran for Muslims, you really have to compare it to the role of Jesus for Christians. In other words, the Quran is the incarnate Word of God, as chanted, as heard, and of course as interpreted, because it is open to wide interpretations as well. The Quran, MacCulloch points out, is rightly preoccupied with both Judaism and Christianity, with the underlying notion that Islam is the fulfillment of Judaism and Christianity. So there's a foundation, at least there, for real cooperation between what would come to be called the people of the book, Jews, Jews, Christians, and Muslims. This notion of Tawheed, again, from the Ethiopian Christian emphasis, gets picked up by Muhammad and becomes the central organizing principle of the faith. This oneness of God, of course, above all, but then also the oneness of the Ummah, or the community. It's a clear contrast, MacCulloch points out on page 258, with Christian quarrels, and that's putting it mildly. It wasn't Christian quarrels, it was Christians warring against each other. But the borrowings from Christianity, or the direct links to Christian practice, are evident. Muslims fast during the month of Ramadan, of course, one of the 5 pillars of the faith, just like Lent. Muslims pray, another pillar of the faith, and they pray in the way that Christians in the East had been praying, that is, on the ground, prostrate. They use prayer mats, also a practice of Christians of the East. They venerate saints and go to saints' tombs. We saw this in Byzantium in particular. And they emphasize pilgrimage in the same way that we saw Egeria making her pilgrimage from Spain through the Holy Land and eventually down to Constantinople. Same was true for Muslims. Pilgrimage to lesser sites, sacred tombs, in particular, but also, of course, the major Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca. Muhammad is considered a prophet in Islam. It is one of the central affirmations of the faith. The first pillar is the Shahada, the confession of faith. There is no God but God, and Muhammad is the prophet of God. There is no God but God. That is emphasizing the unity of God as opposed to this Trinitarian mess that led to so many controversies. But his character as a prophet puts him in the lineage of prophets, back to Abraham and Sarah, and then down to Jesus and Mary, who is a central character in Islamic spirituality and faith and in the Quran as well. But what MacCulloch documents then, after Islam solidifies the death of Muhammad in 632, is one of the most rapid shifts of power in history. He says that on page 259, he's right. But the big question is, there is this potential for collaboration and cooperation between Jews, Christians, and Muslims, the people of the book. The 3 of us share so much. And what if Muhammad had as I believe he intended to unite Jews and Christians with Muslims. And what if Jews and Christians, instead of immediately, in most cases, regarding Muslims as heretics, had engaged in dialogue and moved toward understanding? A big council, say. What if something like that had come along? Because in the Quran, it says very clearly Jews and Christians will have their rewards with God. In other words, Jews and Christians go to heaven. So, Christianity's internal divisions are what led to conquests, the conquests of the various regions. In many places, Islam brought peace, as the name suggests. MacCulloch says Islam means submission. In fact, it means peace. It's from the same root, Islam, as shalom and salam, the word for peace. So for many Christians during this time period, they may have seen Muslims as an Aryan sect, or could have seen them in that way. And of course, there were many Aryan Christians still around, as there are down to today. But the Caliph Umar conquers Jerusalem in 638, but rather than riding in glory in a procession of one kind or another, he rides in on a camel. So emphasizing this humility before this sacred place of Jews and Christians. The next caliph, Abd al-Malik, builds the dome, what is now called the Dome of the Rock, often called the Mosque of Umar, but it's not really that. Umar was gone by this point. But the key here is that Muslims signified through the building of this shrine their respect for Jews, and in contrast to Christians who'd simply left the Temple Mount to fall into ruins. So in 641, Muslims take Egypt, right? And rather than forcibly converting Christians, they practice tolerance to a great degree, allowing Christians there and in Spain and in France. They got as far as France. They practice, again, allowing Christians to continue to practice their faith as people of the book. Same is true for Jews. Kyrgyzstan, and the point is, basically, what we're seeing here is the story of the ruin of the Church of the East. Because for many Christians, converting to Islam, well, it made sense politically in terms of aligning with power, but it was not a huge move from their Christian practices to adopt Islamic practices. So Islam in the East, and often Muslims would take over cathedrals and turn them into mosques. We saw this with Hagia Sophia or Hagia Sophia in the 15th century. But that pattern was followed throughout wherever Muslims landed. And Christians and Jews were considered protected, dhimmi. They were second-class citizens, and there was a special tax for practicing Judaism and Christianity, but they were protected. There's a quote on page 263 from the individual who, at the time, I think he was in Egypt. Let's see. Diophysite bishop in 649, soon after the Muslim conquest, and this would be in the Umayyad Empire. He wrote, "These Arabs fight not against our Christian religion. Nay, rather they defend our faith. They revere our priests and saints, and they make gifts to our churches and monasteries." So, there's this possibility in the historical record of cooperation, dialogue, collaboration, and in fact, in limited instances, that very much continued. And it's a legacy that has been picked up by many Muslim thinkers today, and by many Christians like me, who are engaged in interreligious dialogue especially Christian and Muslim dialogue, as I have been for the last more than a decade now, since 2008. But throughout my life, I have sought to build bridges across Christian and Muslim communities with some success, modest as it is. So, John of Damascus, key figure here, Damascus becoming a central site within Syrian Christianity, was protected, a counselor of the caliph, as a matter of fact, but fell into disfavor politically. Imagine that happening in the historical record. Withdrew to St. Sabin's monastery outside of Jerusalem, and then calls Islam afterwards the forerunner of the Antichrist, in the kind of anathema that would become all too frequent in the historical record, and of course, eventually leading to the grotesqueries of the Crusades. Islam and Eastern Christians, moving on, the rise of Baghdad. Muslims give prominence to the Christian patriarch of Baghdad, and you have Diophysite Christian physicians serving in the caliph's court. And key development, translate Christian documents, especially scientific and philosophical, into Arabic, which then later get translated back into Latin and then lead to the Renaissance. So this indirect, at least, Christian-Muslim cooperation is undoubtedly responsible for the flourishing of the Renaissance, which of course then led to the Reformation, the Enlightenment, and the flourishing of Western civilization as we know it. It's really pretty extraordinary. So MacCulloch says, by the 780s, a quarter of the world's Christians are in the East: Syria, Armenia, China, India. A quarter in the West, Rome and Europe, and a quarter are in Byzantium. And that's why we're spending time on these lost futures, because at the time, it's quite possible that there would have continued to be perhaps the dominant, at least a second to Byzantium, center of Christianity in this Eastern world. The church in China, next section, it's in enduring for the most part, but also in ending. It's unusual in Christian history that Christians learn from and listen to the existing religiosities, but that is what happened within Chinese Christianity in the 700s. There was dialogue with Taoists and with Buddhists, and so Christians were welcomed under various regimes. Unfortunately, the question came up when the Mongols invaded China, and the Mongols were Christians of a sort. Would they continue this sort of listening to Taoist and Confucian and Buddhist teachers? So the next section is the Mongols, New Hope and Catastrophe. The Mongols were brutal, of course, but already we're up to the 12th century. Genghis Khan and his successors might have promoted a Diophysite Christianity throughout Asia, from the Black Sea to the China Sea, MacCulloch speculates. But the rulers after Genghis Khan proved not to be so effective as rulers. So further conflict, military strife, and the Ming Dynasty then arises, which is nativist and xenophobic and outlaws foreign religions, which really crushes, in many ways, the Christian presence in China, other than in underground ways. By this point as well, the Crusades are underway, despite Franciscan diplomacy, and eventually the Mongols lose to the Muslims and themselves become Muslims. Ending, again, this possibility of a strong Christian presence in China and, in fact, throughout Asia, leading to Timur, a Muslim leader who was responsible for brutal massacres of Christians in Central Asia as well. The Ottoman Turks arise during this time period, page 275, and are rightly outraged at the Crusades, which of course were fought primarily against Muslims, but then also against Jews and then against other Christians. I mean, just catastrophic development in Christian history, and we'll have opportunity to pay more attention to its rationale and its operations when we turn to the Church of Rome and its history. But the Ottoman Turks also practice toleration, allowing Christians to continue keeping up the practices from the very earliest presence of Islam. And so there are strong Christian presences throughout what became the Ottoman Empire, even though the Ottomans also fought against the Christians, and the Christians certainly fought against the Ottomans. So the Church of the East and the Church of Armenia see some of the worst stories of martyrdom in Christian history during this period at the hands of the Mongols. And that those legacies, of course, still live on today. Armenia was really the beginning of the 20th century genocides. But that's next semester. Islam in the African churches, then, is the last section of chapter 8. MacCulloch describes defensiveness and decline nearly everywhere. The Copts in Egypt generally are tolerated. Again, they're Miaphysite, not Byzantine nor Roman. But there is persecution after the Crusades in the 14th century. Again, the Crusades really did damage, and their legacy lives on in horrific ways down to today. But the church endures, especially in Ethiopia, in eccentric ways, MacCulloch rightly notes. But there's a golden age of Ethiopian Christianity that emerges in the 12th and 13th centuries, associated especially with Lalibela, and I'll post a link to some of the archaeological sites there. Lalibela is associated also with the renewal of monasticism, and not for the first time nor the last, you see a tension between the monks and the kings, between monasticism and this withdrawal from the world into intentional Christian communities, and the attempt by the kings, by the monarchy, by the secular power to control Christianity. One of the flashpoints was polygamy, widely practiced throughout traditional or indigenous African religions, and also practiced by Christians. The kings were all in favor of it, the laity continued it, but the church was against it officially, but eventually gave up, I guess would be how you would put it. And polygamy continued to be and continues to be practiced among some Christians in Ethiopia and other places around the world. And of course, polygamy was also and is acceptable within Islam too, under certain conditions. Fascinating figure by the name of Zara Yaqub, 1434 to 1468, both military success and intense piety. He himself was a theologian, called himself Constantine, which surprised the Roman Catholic Church when they started engaging in dialogue. But he loved a book in particular called The Miracles of Mary, 12th century French document that was translated into Arabic and then into Ethiopic. And one of the other key features of Ethiopian Christianity was its emphasis on tattooing. Down to today, the cross in blue on the forehead or on one's chin. And Yaqub emphasized or encouraged tattooing of the hands, in particular, with the left hand saying, "I deny the devil," and the right hand saying, "I am a servant of Mary." So, distinctive feature of Christianity, still present and practiced among some down to today. But the Ethiopian church was, by and large, non-Chalcedonian. And as I mentioned in my a post earlier, the largest single Lutheran church in the world is in Ethiopia. It's a much later story, but so a Chalcedonian presence in Ethiopia via the Lutherans eventually. So To conclude, prior to Islam, MacCulloch says on page 284, there was a good chance that the center of Christianity might have moved east to Iraq rather than west to Rome. Instead, what occurred, because of Christian divisions, conflicts, and warring, was decline in numbers, suffering, and martyrdom that is still continuing. Now, that martyrdom, again, points to a particular side of the story. MacCulloch here is siding, by and large, with the Christians, but I hope that my words in this little mini lecture have offered somewhat of a counter to any Islamophobic interpretation of Christian history. The fact is, Christians, through their own divisions and through their wars with each other, set the stage for the rise of this religion of peace throughout the Arabian Peninsula, leading to the decline of the Church of the East and the continuation in limited ways, the church in Byzantium, and of course, eventually to Orthodoxy. We'll see the story as Christianity moves to Russia, and then the church in the West, which is where we turn next. I hope this is valuable, and I look forward to your reading responses. Peace.